Hello everybody, and welcome to today's deep dive, where I'll be attempting to answer the question, who is the true villain of Death Note? Now before I start this video, a few potential misconceptions regarding the answer to this question needs to be addressed. Firstly, those who are under the assumption that the answer to this question is seemingly quite obvious, seeing as though Light is the clear protagonist of the series, and L the clear antagonist, therefore Light must be the hero, and L the villain, isn't necessarily the truth, as labeling a character either protagonist or antagonist only really means that they're fulfilling a role in the narrative, the protagonist being the driver of the story, and the antagonist being the one attempting to stop said driver from achieving their goal, regardless of how immoral that goal may be. And what I mean by this is that if the protagonist weren't to make the decisions they make at the beginning of the narrative, then the entirety of said narrative wouldn't exist. Take for example Light's decision to test out the notebook in episode 1. If Light were to never make this decision, then the events that ensue over the course of the show would never take place. However, because Light does make this decision, he pushes the story forward, and is the reason for its existence. Same goes with the antagonist, who in this case is L, as he's the one attempting to stop Light from achieving his goal, regardless of how evil that goal may be. He's still labelled the antagonist. Secondly, isn't necessarily a misconception. However, I do just want to clarify for the purposes of this video, the definition of a villain. Now a lot of people like to use the word villain and antagonist interchangeably, seeing as though the majority of the time, antagonists are usually also the villain of the story, seeing as though they're often a far more evil character than that of the protagonist. However, in the case of Death Note, both its protagonist and antagonist are just as evil as one another, therefore deciphering who is the villain and who is the hero isn't quite as simple. But in today's video, I plan on answering that very question, and the way I'm going to do it is by breaking down who out of Light and L is a more evil character. Now the way in which I'm going to decipher which of these two is the greater evil isn't necessarily going to be by looking at their actions, but rather the motivations behind them. Why are they committing the seemingly evil acts they commit? As stated by Albert Camus in his book The Plague, good intentions may do as much harm as malevolence, if they lack understanding. The soul of the murderer is blind, and there can be no true goodness nor true love without the utmost clear-sightedness. Or as mentioned in several of my previous videos, evil isn't necessarily the act itself, but rather the intentions behind it. Now Light's reasoning for committing the crimes he commits, in this case serial mass murder, aren't as clear-cut or obvious as people may believe, as a lot of Death Note fans are under the impression that Light kills all of the people he kills in an attempt to make the world a better place, and also reap the rewards that come with committing said crimes, i.e. being revered as a god in the New World. However, what if I were to tell you that this in fact couldn't be further from the truth, and Light actually committed all of the evil acts he committed, simply because he was bored? Think about it. Imagine being the smartest student in the country, whose path in life is pretty much already guaranteed. What is there to look forward to? What are you possibly going to find interesting, if you're truly just a level above everybody else? Well, the only logical answer is surely finding somebody above your level, which in Light's case, is L Laureate.
私はエルです。まさか。何を言ってるんだこいつ。エルがエルだと言うはずがない。
Now when Light's called out by L in the second episode of the show, if he were to truly want nothing more than to just make the world a better place, and be revered as god of the New World, all he would have had to do is nothing. He could have simply just kept on killing in his room, have never attempted to go after L, and create what he believes to be a better world. However, this isn't what Light wants. He instead wants to play a chess match with arguably the smartest human being on the planet, hence why he attempts to kill L the moment he appears on live television. And when Light finds out that he's in fact been tricked by L, although he is at first in a state of shock, he eventually winds up a smile, and openly admits that this is getting interesting. Now I'm not in any way saying that boredom is Light's only motivation, because it's not. But what I am saying is that if Light were to never have found himself, let's say lucky enough, to be the one who first picks up the Death Note, then he would have never gone on to commit the evil acts he commits, as becoming a mass murderer were never his true intentions. Which is further proven by the fact that Light actually only kills the first person he kills, simply because he's intrigued by whether or not the Death Note is actually real, and states later on in the show that he actually regrets murdering said criminal, seeing as though his crimes are rather minor in comparison to the criminals he goes on to kill later on in the show, even throwing up after killing his second criminal, as he doesn't believe the crime he committed, which in fact he didn't even yet commit, was worthy of death. Now for those who want to make the argument that Light does eventually just turn into a cold-hearted killer, with no remorse for his actions whatsoever, I'd argue this change to only be natural, as firstly, he's never in contact with any of the people he kills, so half of the pain that comes with physically seeing another human die just isn't there. And secondly, if you were responsible for the deaths of so many people, over the course of time your heart would naturally go through the process of becoming more colder, as you become far more accustomed to what is now just an everyday occurrence. Hence why you might see a soldier, just no longer fazed by death, as they're so used to it. In fact, you could also argue this to be a necessary evolution in Light's character, as in order for him to defeat a character like L, somebody will do literally anything to get a step closer to you, and I mean literally anything. You have to view the game you're playing on without any emotion. As described by Nier, a character like Mello might make reckless decisions, which could disadvantage him, simply because he's viewing the chessboard he's playing on filled with emotion, and with the stakes so high, any wrong move could cost you your life. Therefore you realistically are left with no other choice but to disassociate yourself from your own emotions. Hence why characters like Nier are able to remain calm when the majority of his task force are blowing their brains out right beside him. L also making it apparent that if Light were to have any reaction whatsoever to committing the murders he commits, L would immediately be able to deduce that he's Kira when watching him on the monitors. Now in regards to the justification of Light's crimes, which was surprisingly only ever brought up once in the show, seeing as though creator Tsugumi Ohba didn't really want to explore the moral complexities of Light's actions, as it might have taken away from the intensity and flow of the story, Light describes himself as the only hope for mankind, the one maintaining order, responsible for stopping wars, and reducing the world's crime rate by 70%, a person the world needs, if it were to ever improve. However, whilst Light's described intentions here are good, what he's doing isn't really solving anything, as criminals aren't born necessarily from evil, but rather real-world problems, often leaving them with no choice but to commit the crimes they commit, and Light killing these people isn't eliminating the source of the problem, but rather just the products of it. So whilst Light claims he's making the world a better place, by reducing crime by 70%, all he's really doing is just forcing these criminals to become smarter when running their operations, as the threat of death often isn't going to be enough to deter a man on the brink of desperation from doing whatever he's about to do. And Nier, or should I say the author, seeing as though he claims this quote to be his own opinion, attempts to sum this up, when he says that it doesn't matter whether or not a god's teachings are before me, I'm still going to question whether or not what I'm doing is right or wrong, essentially saying that morality is subjective, no matter the calibre of person who tells you otherwise, and then goes on to call Light nothing more than a crazy mass murderer, which is a very black and white way to look at this situation, as you aren't really taking into account the intentions behind his actions, but rather just the actions themselves. Now if you were to ask me whether or not I believe what Light is doing to be a good idea, I'd say no, simply because there isn't realistically much long-term benefit when it comes to actually putting a stop to crime, and if you were to really want to simplify this, you could just argue that he's legalising the death penalty worldwide, however devoid of all the expenses that come with keeping a prisoner alive until their date, instead just killing them there and then, without any real proof that they've actually committed the crime they've been accused of. However, the problem here is that when Light gets a hold of the notebook, he's only 17 years old, and when we're younger, we tend to have much more extremist views when it comes to solving specific problems, simply because we lack the knowledge and understanding regarding the real source of the problem. And as we as humans grow up and gain more knowledge, or perhaps come to terms with the fact that our solutions to these problems are simply just impossible to pull off, we start to understand that our original ideas as, say, a young adult on how to solve such a specific problem maybe weren't as logical as we once thought. Take for example when I was about 15, I used to believe that the government shouldn't give lazy people money, and that they should either get a job, or go homeless. And I believed this because I lacked the knowledge and understanding of the entire scope of the problem, failing to take into account, say, a person's mental well-being, or the fact that they might be disabled, and therefore unable to work. And what would have been my attempt at a solution during that time just simply wouldn't have worked. And this is a problem that Light faces, because unlike me and many others, Light is actually presented at that age with a specific tool capable of fixing the problem. However, due to his lack of knowledge on said problem, goes about dealing with it in the most black and white of ways, never giving him the opportunity to grow up and realise that what he's doing is both wrong and not solving anything, as Light has been presented with the impossible, and isn't in the same boat as many of us, who perhaps might come to terms with the fact that our solutions to these problems are once again simply just impossible to pull off. Yes, Kira's actions are evil, however his claimed intentions are good, yet we all know that he's actually only doing what he's doing because he's bored and wants to pass the time, and because of this has roped himself into a high stakes game, which if he were to lose, would spend the rest of his life in prison, surrounded by those he would have murdered sooner or later. So the question you have to ask yourself is whether or not Light truly enjoyed his time chasing Elle, because if he did, then all of the choices Light made after killing Lindell Taylor were extremely selfish, ego-driven, and evil. However, if Light felt like he had no other choice but to kill Elle in order to preserve his own life, while simultaneously bettering the world, then no, Light isn't necessarily evil.
There are many types of monsters in this world. Monsters who will not show themselves and who cause trouble. Monsters who abduct children. Monsters who devour dreams. Monsters who suck blood. And monsters who always tell lies. Lying monsters are a real nuisance. They are much more cunning than other monsters.
They pose as humans, even though they have no understanding of the human heart. They eat, even though they've never experienced hunger. They study, even though they have no interest in academics. They seek friendship, even though they do not know how to love. If I were to encounter such a monster, I would likely be eaten by it. Because in truth, I am that monster.
Now let me ask you all a question. If the methods you take in an attempt to capture the devil are just as worse as the actions of the devil, then who is who? See, Elle is described as a character who doesn't care about anything besides solving the case he is working on. A character who will literally do anything to get a step closer to his target, regardless of how immoral whatever he's doing may seem. Examples include sacrificing people, lying, and breaking the law. Now for those who may want to argue that Elle only ever sacrifices criminals who are scheduled to be executed, therefore he's far more righteous than Light in this regard, we're never told by Elle what he's perhaps promising these people in exchange for them doing what he asks. And I honestly believe that if not for Elle being forced into working with the Japanese police, he would have no problem sacrificing, say, innocent people in an attempt to get a step closer to catching Kira. This point being backed up in Death Note How to Read, which claims on page 11 that Elle will literally do anything until he's satisfied with the answers of the case. In Elle Changed the World, when Naomi Misora speculates whether or not it was truly the real Elle who was contacting her, she remembers that she had heard several horror stories regarding what Elle had done to people trying to pass themselves off as him, and whilst this story is a different timeline, I do still think this point is worth mentioning. Elle also was responsible for setting up Elle's successors in Wami's house, which is essentially a bunch of orphans being taken in and trained by Watery to become the next Elle. However, Elle's intentions here were to not create, let's call it a powerful league of detectives, but rather he did this just for his own amusement, with Watery's methods being so extreme and abusive. The very first child selected as Elle's successor actually ended up killing himself because of the torture he had to endure, and the second successor, who was named literally Backup, felt so manipulated and tormented that he used the Shinigami eyes he was born with to commit murders, all in an attempt to create a case that Elle was unable to solve. Now, as mentioned prior, if Elle's intentions here were to simply create super detectives, then perhaps you could maybe, in fact no, in any context you're going to struggle to justify the manipulation and torture of innocent children, and the fact that Elle's intentions here were actually nothing more than to amuse himself make this act all the more evil, with Elle never showing any signs of remorse regarding this issue. However, for those who might want to argue that whilst this torture was taking place, Elle was also only a child, therefore lacked the maturity and outlook an adult might have on this situation, therefore he's not as evil as I'm making him out to be, need to consider two things. One is the possibility that these methods are still being utilised during the events of Death Note, a time in which Elle is very much not a child, and two is the fact that on several occasions, Elle himself has claimed to still be very childish despite his age. Therefore I'd argue that it's safe to assume he still finds tormenting and manipulating children funny. Now, in relation to the question asked a moment ago, one could argue that yes, sometimes in order to defeat evil, you have to do whatever is necessary, regardless of whatever that might make you. However, Elle doing what he did to these children genuinely makes me question whether or not he, like Light, just enjoys going to war with another person similar to his level. See, if L was doing what he was doing because he believed himself to be a necessity to this world, one who's willing to do the unthinkable for the greater good, then fine, you wouldn't necessarily consider him to be evil. However, one who's only doing it to appease his own boredom or ego, this being backed up by L literally stating that he'll only take whatever cases he feels like taking, is undeniably a morally questionable individual, which when put side by side with Light Yagami, somebody who truly believes that what they're doing is better in the world, and at times actually regrets a few of the criminals he kills, is a far more morally commendable character than somebody whose only regret is not solving the Kira case alone. Anyway, I just want to thank you all so much for watching. Please make sure to like, subscribe and turn on post notifications, and I'll see you all in the next one. Peace!